think you'll find, sir, that there will come a time when black people wake up and become intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, as other humans are intellectually independent enough to think for themselves. Then the black man will think like a black man, and he will feel for other black people. And this new thinking and feeling will cause black people to stick together. And then at that point, you'll have a situation where when you attack one black man, you are attacking all black men. And this type of black thinking will cause all black people to stick together. And this type of thinking also will bring an end to the brutality inflicted upon black people by white people. And it is the only thing that will bring an end to it. No federal court, state court, or city court will bring an end to it. It's something that the black man has to bring an end to.
Apparently, two men approached the speaker's rostrum and discharged shots at him from apparently very close range.
As I turned around quickly, and the next thing I saw was Malcolm falling back in a dead faint.
My mother threw herself over her babies, and she yelled out, "They're killing my husband."
I heard shots, and I saw people crawling on the floor. And so I got down too. Then when I was looking out, and I saw someone look in amazement to the front, I knew they had shot my husband.
He sustained one shot in the lower right chin, and the other 6 hit him in the chest and body.
I looked out at him and I said, he's going to die. I kept saying to myself, he's going to die, he's going to die.
How many immediately? No, he wasn't dead immediately, but expired very shortly thereafter.
To the family of Mr. Islam and the family of Malcolm X, that I apologize for what were serious, unacceptable violations of law and the public trust. I apologize on behalf of our nation's law enforcement for this decades-long injustice, which has eroded public faith in institutions that are designed to guarantee equal protection of the law. Your Honor, we can't restore what was taken away from these men and their families, but by correcting the record, perhaps we can begin to restore that faith. We began, Your Honor, by committing to reinvestigate this matter through our Conviction Integrity Program. And I'm here today at council table with Deputy Chief Charles King and our General Counsel, Karen Dunn, who worked hand in hand with the Innocence Project and the Chinese law firm on this 2-year reinvestigation and the joint motion which we have now submitted to the court. As detailed in our papers, there are 2 grounds for our motion: newly discovered evidence and the failure to disclose exculpatory evidence. There is only one ultimate conclusion. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were wrongfully convicted of the crime. Since January 2020, my office's Conviction Integrity team has been reinvestigating this case in complete open file collaboration with the Innocence Project and the Chinese law firm, who are joint counsel for Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam. Now, our search for the truth was severely impacted by the passage of time. In the decades since the tragic afternoon at the Audubon Bowling, every police investigator and trial attorney on this case has died. In a case that rested entirely on eyewitness testimony, every single eyewitness to testify at trial has done. All of the physical evidence, including the shotgun used in the murder, is gone. No telephone records were obtained at the time, and there is no way to get them now. But what we have obtained in this reinvestigation now are numerous materials that my office tragically did not have in 1965, and thus did not turn over to the defense. Most critically, we have obtained dozens and dozens of reports from the FBI and the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services and Investigations. These records include FBI reports of witnesses who failed to identify Mr. Islam and who implicated other subjects and suspects. And significantly, we now have reports revealing that on orders from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, the FBI ordered multiple witnesses not to tell police or prosecutors that they were, in fact, FBI informants. Many of those documents were exculpatory. None of them were disclosed to the defense. Without these files, it is clear these men did not receive a fair trial, and in our opinion, their convictions must be vacated. Moreover, under the unique circumstances presented by a 56-year-old case, there can be no retrial on any of the charges contained in the indictment. Therefore, Your Honor, the people believe the indictment against Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam should be dismissed. So, on behalf of the people of the state of New York, together with the attorneys from the Innocent Project and the Cheney's law firm, we jointly move to vacate these convictions on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and the failure to disclose exculpatory evidence at trial, and to dismiss indictment number 871 of 1965 against them. Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel, anything from you?
Yes, Your Honor. Judge Biben, I'm honored to stand here today with my client, Muhammad Aziz, and on behalf of the late Khalil Islam. Today, in an application we made jointly with the district attorney, as you just heard, Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam moved to vacate their convictions under criminal procedure law, section 440.10(1)(g), based on newly discovered evidence, and to dismiss the cases against them. As a procedural matter, my clients respectfully request that the records be sealed pursuant to section 16050, but the sealing be stayed for 5 days in order so as not to interfere with the significant media coverage taking place here today. In 1965, Muhammad and Khalil were both innocent young black men who were arrested within weeks of the murder of Malcolm X and falsely accused of participating in that terrible crime. These men became victims of the same racism and injustice that were the antithesis of all that Malcolm X stood for. Before, during, and after these men's trial, the NYPD and FBI covered up a tremendous amount of evidence of their innocence, hiding it even from the district attorney. As a result, when Mujahid Halim from New Jersey testified under oath that he and 4 Confederates killed Malcolm X, and that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam had nothing to do with it, he was called a liar, while the NYPD and FBI sat on a trove of evidence that corroborated his testimony. The defendants, their lawyers, the court, the prosecution, and the public at large were deceived and cheated. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were wrongfully convicted, and most of the men who murdered Malcolm X never faced justice. Muhammad Aziz was 26 years old when his personal nightmare began. Today he is 83. He is a dignified and brave man who has survived enough injustice and suffering for 1,000 lifetimes. Khalil Islam, a beloved husband, brother, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, died more than a decade ago, still fighting to clear his name. It's tragic that he never lived to see the day of his exoneration, something he very much deserved. Nothing can give back to these men or their families the decades of freedom that were stolen from them. With that being said, District Attorney Cyrus Vance's decision to join us in correcting these wrongful convictions is extremely important, and it was the just and right thing to do. I want to acknowledge also his General Counsel, Carrie Dunn, Assistant District Attorneys Charles King and Peter Casolero for their integrity, professionalism, and candor in this process. I want to thank my co-counsel at the Innocence Project, Barry Scheck and Vanessa Potkin, for working with us on this historic effort. I also want to thank the countless supporters and advocates who have stood behind Muhammad and Khalil, including many community leaders who denounced this injustice. Among them is the Honorable Albert Vann, former City Councilman and State Assemblyman, who 40 years ago, as chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus, called for Muhammad and Khalil's release and aptly noted that neither Malcolm's memory nor justice is served when two innocent men languish in prison for a crime they did not commit. I thank Mr. Van for joining us here today, among our client's many other supporters. Finally, I wish to acknowledge and appreciate Abdur Rahman Muhammad, Rachel Drexen, and Phil Bertelson, who recently created the work Who Killed Malcolm X, work that shone a bright light on this tragic injustice and helped us get where we are today. And last, I want to thank the fabulous lawyers in my office, including Morgan Miller and especially Deborah Francois, who traveled the country with me during the pandemic to investigate this case, to get to the truth, and to exonerate two innocent men. With that, Your Honor, I give the floor to Barry Sheff.
Your Honor, I join in all the remarks of my colleague, Mr. Shays. It is an honor and a privilege for the Innocence Project to be representing Mr. Aziz and the family of Mr. Islam. The damage done to them and their families by this wrongful conviction is immeasurable. Truth be told, this has been an exoneration in plain sight for decades. Scholars, journalists, and the filmmakers that made Who Killed Malcolm X, Mike Wallace, in 1980, in an incredible episode also entitled Who Killed Malcolm X, brought forth a lot of the evidence that we have relied upon here today to make the case that these two men were wrongfully convicted and that exculpatory evidence was suppressed. Truth be told, today's official acknowledgement that the FBI and NYPD suppressed exculpatory evidence in their possession in 1966, even from the prosecutors, is what led to their wrongful conviction. They would have not been convicted, and I think I can fairly say, with the evidence that we saw in the reinvestigation, Mr. Halim would have been vindicated. They would have agreed and found the four other people that committed this crime with him. If that information, that exculpatory information, had been disclosed, not only would it have changed the verdict in this case, but it would change the history of the civil rights movement in this country. It would not have been a total surprise for the American public to know about what's known as Operation COINTELPRO, which was a systematic effort, unfortunately, by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to disrupt the Black Power and civil rights movement in this country. And it is an enormous tragedy that this assassination occurred on the very day that Malcolm X was about to give a speech announcing and explaining the Organization of African American Unity, which was an extraordinary step in the progress of the civil rights movement in this country. Bitter truth be told, that disclosure of exculpatory evidence to the prosecutors, to the defense, and to the public did not happen. We don't know exactly how or why this exculpatory evidence was suppressed. The investigation was able to get more information, but the bigger question of how or why this happened still remain unanswered. It would be helpful, as Mr. Van, who's here today, and others have called for, a larger investigation with greater access to evidence to get the history right. We think that should happen. But it was beyond the capacity of this conviction reinvestigation process to do that. Now, official acknowledgement of a wrongful conviction is extraordinarily important. It didn't do Mr. Aziz or the family of Mr. Islam, an enormous amount of benefit to know that everybody recognized who had seriously studied this case, that they were innocent. What mattered is what Cyrus Vance, Carrie Dunn, Charles King, and Peter Casolaro did with us in this case, and that is just acknowledge the bitter truth. It's not a great day for celebration, but acknowledging the bitter truth officially, the state admitting that it was wrong, is an enormous step. Now, I know that he's not going to like it, but our friend Peter Casolaro was somebody that we asked Mr. Benz, Mr. Dunn, and Mr. King to work on this case. And Peter Casolaro also worked with Ms. Hopkin and I years ago, reinvestigating the case of people we call the exonerated five, the people that were wrongly convicted of having attacked a Central Park jogger. And we are really grateful to our colleagues for allowing and assigning Peter to work on this case. He is a brilliant lawyer. He is a person of terrific integrity. Couldn't be here today because of a hip operation, and he's very, very modest. But he is somebody that speaks truth to power. So with that, I turn it over to
I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I know that co-counsel Deborah Francois is going to talk more extensively about the tremendous devastating impact of this wrongful conviction on Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam. I did want to bring into the fold today the family of Malcolm X and the devastation that his assassination brought to his wife, Betty Shabazz, who was with him, his daughters who were in the ballroom and witnessed their father assassinated, and the consequences for his family, and also the consequences for the world. We lost a great leader, and when we look at the criminal legal system and where we are today as we're waiting for justice and verdicts in the Rittenhouse case and Ahmaud Arbery, where have we come? We still have a system that works to protect some and oppress others. And what would the world have been had this assassination not taken place? What would Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's life have been if the past 55 years had not been robbed from them and their families? I would just like to reiterate what Barry said, which is this conviction integrity process focused on Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's wrongful convictions. And it unearthed evidence that the FBI and the NYPD hid evidence. These were not just innocent mistakes, and many wrongful convictions aren't. They're the result of official misconduct. And it doesn't stop with this exoneration. We need to know how, we need to know why, and we need to understand the extent of the involvement of the government in both the assassination of Malcolm X and the wrongful conviction of Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. I echo the sentiments of my colleagues that it is a privilege to be here today on behalf of Muhammad Aziz and the late Khalil Islam. As others have described, it is an understatement to say that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam have suffered tremendously. Evidence of their innocence was in the hands of the FBI within hours of the murder of Malcolm X. In the weeks and months that followed, the FBI and NYPD continued to amass a wealth of information pointing to 5 men from New Jersey as the true killers of Malcolm X and demonstrating Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's innocence. Both the FBI and NYPD withheld such evidence from the defense and the prosecution, allowing 2 innocent men to spend a combined 42 years in prison. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's wrongful convictions and decades-long imprisonment caused far-reaching loss for both men, for their families and communities, for Malcolm X's family, and for all of us who believe in and work to uphold the integrity of the criminal justice system. While Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were denied a fair trial back in 1966, it is not too late to give them a measure of justice today. District Attorney Cyrus Vance has made the just and wise decision to join with us in moving to vacate these men's convictions, dismiss all charges against them, and clear names. It is now my true honor to turn the floor over to Muhammad Aziz.
The event that brought us to court today should never have occurred.
Those events were and are the result of a process that was corrupt to its core, one that was all too familiar to black people in 2021. While I do not need this court, these prosecutors, or a piece of paper to tell me I'm innocent, I am very glad that my family, my friends, and the attorneys who have worked and supported me all of these years are finally seeing the truth that we have all known, officially recognized. I'm an 83-year-old man who was victimized by the criminal justice system. I do not know how many more years of creative activity I have. However, I hope the same system that was responsible for this travesty of justice also takes responsibility for the immeasurable harm caused to me during the last 55 or 56 years. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further? Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. The court has reviewed the joint motion that's been filed today, which seeks a vacator of the judgments of conviction of Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam pursuant to Criminal Procedure Law 440-10-1G on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and failure to disclose exculpatory information, and for dismissal of Indictment 871 of 1965 against them pursuant to Criminal Procedure Law 21040. With respect to the CPL 440-10-1G motion to vacate, as set forth in that joint motion and through the record established today, the court finds that an earnest reinvestigation has uncovered significant evidence that was not known to the defendants at the time of the trial, which evidence is of such character as to create a probability that had such evidence been received at the trial, the verdict would have been more favorable to the defendants. Under New York law, dismissal of an indictment in the interest of justice is warranted only where such dismissal is required as a matter of judicial discretion by the existence of some compelling factor, consideration, or circumstances clearly demonstrating that the conviction of a defendant upon the indictment would constitute or result in injustice. The court has and must consider the factors set forth in CPL Section 21040, Sub 1, and as the New York courts have clarified, the court's discretion to dismiss an indictment should be exercised sparingly, end quote, in that rare and unusual case which cries out for fundamental injustice beyond the confines of conventional considerations. That's People versus Insignaris, 109 AD 2D 221, First Department, quoting People versus Belge, 41 New York 2D 60. There can be no question that this is a case that cries out for fundamental justice. This court's paramount purpose is, and always has been, to uphold the law and pursue justice. To Mr. Aziz and your family, and to the family of Mr. Islam, I regret that this court cannot fully undo the serious miscarriages of justice in this case and give you back the many years that were lost. Dismissal of the indictment is the full extent of this court's authority. But for the reasons set forth in the joint application and based on the record that has been made today, this court's mandate requires that the judgments of conviction be vacated and that the indictment against Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam be dismissed. The joint motion is hereby granted, and the record with respect to Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam will be sealed, and at the party's request, sealing of that record will be stayed for 5 days until November 26th. Thank you very much.
Who killed Malcolm X? 3 black Muslims, members of the Nation of Islam, were convicted. But the current leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, now acknowledges that words he spoke may have triggered the assassination.
As I may have been complicit in words that I spoke, I acknowledge that and regret that any word that I have said caused the loss of life of a human being.
Malcolm X was murdered 35 years ago in 1965. Today, the black revolutionary, once feared and misunderstood, enjoys a popularity and respect reserved for leaders like Martin Luther King, Jr. The autobiography of Malcolm X was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 most important nonfiction books of the last century. And Denzel Washington was nominated for an Academy Award for his portrayal of Malcolm in Spike Lee's film. Who killed Malcolm X? 3 black Muslims, members of the Nation of Islam, were convicted. 2 of them served 20 years. The 3rd is still not free. But the current leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, has long been suspected as the instigator, the behind-the-scenes force who triggered the killing. Malcolm's late widow believed that, as do his children to this day. But now, finally, Atala Shabazz, the eldest daughter of Malcolm X, and Louis Farrakhan, agreed to talk about the assassination for the first time in front of a reporter. For Shabazz, not without some misgivings.
I did not know if I wanted to sit across from him. I didn't know if my heart could handle it.
Didn't know if she could sit with a man she still holds responsible for her father's death. Confronting Minister Farrakhan would not be easy, and for strength, she told us, she summoned the memory of her parents.
Before I came here, I prayed and included my parents. They had to walk with me to the airport. They had to get me out of that hotel and into the property here.
You see, Atala Shabazz was there in the Audubon Ballroom in 1965 in New York to watch her father make a speech. She was there with her 2 younger sisters and her pregnant mother. And Atala, only 6 years old, watched as gunmen killed her father. Here's how her late mother, Betty Shabazz, described the murder.
I heard shots, and I saw people crawling on the floor. And so I got down too. Then when I was looking out and I saw someone look in amazement to the front, I knew they had shot my husband. And my children were crying, you know, what's going on? What's going on? Are they going to shoot us?
I'm a child with a forever memory of the most significant man in my life standing at a podium and falling backwards. That's forever.
Miss Shabazz, for several months, I carried the picture of your father with all of these bullet holes in his chest. And I looked at the man that taught me, the man that nurtured me, the man that was the example of a man to me. And I wept.
His pain came from their shared history. As is well known, Malcolm was a dope peddler and street hustler. But during his 7 years in prison, he was introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, considered a holy man by his followers in the Nation of Islam. And eventually, Malcolm became the spokesman for the nation, at the time preaching that the white man was evil and calling for the separation of the races. And along the way, Louis Farrakhan, a former nightclub singer, became Malcolm's student, his acolyte. And Malcolm taught Farrakhan how to live as a black Muslim. Example, Nation of Islam members don't eat pork, don't smoke, don't drink alcohol, and do not have sex outside marriage.
It is worthy, if you will, of expulsion.
That is correct.
Adultery.
That is correct. Fornication was worthy of expulsion.
But in 1963, Malcolm X learned that Elijah Muhammad himself had repeatedly committed adultery with some of his teenage secretaries and had children with them. Malcolm agonized over his discovery, and in June of 1964, he told me about it.
And he called some of these women who were living in Los Angeles at the time and let me listen to the conversation. And it became apparent that he was telling the truth. He told you about that, yes?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, Malcolm was aware of other tensions growing within the Nation of Islam, for his popularity had begun to surpass that of Elijah Muhammad.
There was a dynamic inside of the nation that troubled Brother Malcolm at the highest echelon of leadership.
Well, the fact of the
There
matter...
was envy. There was envy.
Envy of Malcolm.
Of Malcolm.
By
there
you?
were- no, never by me.
Never by you?
Never by me. Never. I truly loved this man.
Who envied him?
There are those in the circle who feared the kind of publicity that he was getting, the kind of attention that he was getting. He was the most vocal. He was the most loved. He was the most honored and respected.
And he outshone the Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
In certain areas, yes.
In 1964, Malcolm X broke with the Nation of Islam to form his own organization based on orthodox Muslim principles, which include a respect for all races and religions. And how did Louis Farrakhan react? He began writing incendiary editorials in the Nation of Islam's newspaper.
Let me read you what you wrote in December of 1964. The die is set, and Malcolm shall not escape, especially after such evil, foolish talk about his benefactor, Elijah Muhammad, in trying to rob him of the divine glory which Allah has bestowed upon him. Such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death. This was only 2 months before he was shot down. That is why people believe that you were responsible for the death of Malcolm X.
No, not at all. My name was not among those at that time who were considered the players.
Nonetheless, following those editorials, Malcolm and his family received numerous death threats from whom no one knows for sure.
Are you not, perhaps, afraid of what might happen to you as a result of making these revelations?
Oh, yes. I probably am a dead man already.
But Farrakhan says that Elijah Muhammad had issued a warning to his followers.
Leave Minister Malcolm alone. Those were orders. Those were instructions to us. Leave this man alone.
But in February of 1965, while the family was asleep, Malcolm's home in New York was firebombed. And just 1 week later, 39-year-old Malcolm X was gunned down by members of the Nation of Islam. But there are those who still believe the government had a hand in Malcolm's death. Fact is, for years, the FBI and the New York City Police had Malcolm X under surveillance. Just 7 years ago, he was still charging that Malcolm had deserved punishment.
And if we dealt with him like a nation deals with a traitor, what the hell business is it of yours?
But now Louis Farrakhan, recuperating from prostate cancer and facing his own mortality, has a different appreciation of Malcolm X, and he wanted Adil Shabazz to know it. He did most of the talking during our 4-hour meeting. Finally, Shabazz could no longer hold back 35 years of anguish.
Indeed, the FBI probably had something to do with it. But we have to say that adult men between the ages of 20 and 40, black faces, who chose to put a trigger in their hands and unload until it was empty, have to be culpable. You can't keep pointing the finger because my father was not killed from a grassy knoll. And I have sisters who are spun out into this environment as tumbleweed, unhealed. We knew to stay silent because as a child, I thought it could happen to me. That if I spoke up or said something, they'd take my mother. They'd take one of us. I got to hear reports of the traitor deserved it, so it never could go away. Those reports didn't come from the government. Those reports did not come from the police. They came from the tan and brown and black faces that once claimed themselves as family members.
Woods, pretty face, but I'm known for hitting drugs. Yeah. Got him like, too good. To the yard, he ain't never leave his pretty on God. Broke, too good. Real boss, nigga got the Woods, pretty face, but I'm known for hitting drugs. Yeah. Got him like, too good. To the yard, he ain't never leave his pretty on God. Broke, too good. Real boss, nigga got the good. Real boss, nigga